Manager of Fellowship Programs here at the National Endowment for Democracy. On behalf of NED's International Forum for Democratic Studies, I'm pleased to welcome you to today's presentation, Threats to Defenders of Democracy in Balochistan, featuring Reagan-Fussell Democracy Fellow Malik Siraj Akbar, with comments by Brian Joseph, Senior Director for Asia and Multi-Regional Programs here at the National Endowment for Democracy. As many of you may know, the Reagan-Fussell Democracy Fellows Program is a federally funded exchange visitor program that hosts some of the world's most dedicated democracy activists, journalists, and scholars to conduct independent research and pursue projects here at the National Endowment for Democracy. Now in our 10th anniversary year, the program has hosted about 180 fellows from 79 countries since 2001. Among this impressive group, our speaker today stands out for his extraordinary courage and commitment to covering the human rights situation in his native Balochistan. Malik Siraj Akbar is founding editor of the Baloch Hal, Pakistan's first online local newspaper, and former Balochistan bureau chief of the Daily Times, one of Pakistan's leading leading English language newspapers. He's the author of the Redefined Dimensions of the Baloch Nationalist Movement, as well as numerous articles on press freedom, human rights, religious radicalism, and the war on terror in Pakistan. You can follow his ongoing coverage of Pakistan on his Huffington Post blog. In his talk today, Malik will share with us the disturbing trend of human rights violations in the Pakistani province of Balochistan and the threats faced by journalists like himself in bringing such stories to light. Over the past decade, away from the glare of the international media, an ongoing conflict has unfolded in Balochistan between the state and those seeking to protect and strengthen human rights in the region. While this is a highly contested conflict that arouses deep passion on all sides, the plight of ordinary civilians, political leaders, scholars, students, activists, and others cannot be denied nor disputed. By shifting our attention to the human costs of the conflict, Malik seeks to encourage all stakeholders to undertake steps towards accountability, a peaceful, democratic solution to the conflict, and the protection of the lives and well-being of all peoples in the region. Our discussant today, Mr. Brian Joseph, is Senior Director for Asia and Multi-Regional Programs here at the National Endowment for Democracy, where he oversees a portfolio of grants that supports the work of hundreds of civil society organizations in the region. He travels regularly to South Asia and has spoken and written widely about Pakistan, human rights in Asia, and democracy promotion in closed societies. He has served as regional coordinator for Amnesty International USA and as a member of the International Human Rights Funders Group and the Burma Donors Forum. We'll now turn the floor over to Malik, who will speak for approximately 40 minutes, followed by Brian, who will speak for about 10. For those of you on Twitter, you may follow this presentation and contribute to the conversation by using the hashtag NED events or by following the endowment at NED Democracy. If you have not already done so, please take a moment to silence your cell phones. And finally, let me take this opportunity to thank staff members Sally Blair, Melissa Ayton-Becknell, Reagan Updegraff, Sarah Boucher, Ryan Doherty, Chris Thurow, Mike Crump, and most especially Research Associate Johanna Nasefa for the help in organizing today's event. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Xerxes, for this wonderful introduction. A talk on Balochistan normally coincides with a very bad debt. last year when I was invited at the University of California, Berkeley, to give a talk on Balochistan. It happened on May 3rd, and my audience was a lot more interested in knowing about Abbottabad rather than Balochistan. And a lot of people today would also be interested in knowing the Abbottabad raid, which killed Osama bin Laden, and people, my Pakistani friends tell me, are you trying to embarrass the Pakistani government, or are you just trying to divert attention from the actual conversation? But I think the issue on Balochistan is like one of the issues that oftentimes rarely gets featured. But before we head out to the actual topic, I would like to extend my heartfelt gratitude to National Endowment for Democracy and this wonderful country for hosting so many Democrats at risk from different parts of the world so generously and so courageously. I would like to extend my gratitude to Carl Grushman, the president of NED, Mark Plattner, program director, Sally Blair, Xerxes Spencer, Melissa, Judith Welling, and my research associate, Johanna Nasifa, for helping me out with the whole research that I had been undertaking. So when we talk of a country like Pakistan, or when we make a statement about Pakistan, it's like it carries a lot of stereotypes. But Pakistan is kind of a country where if you have like 7 people from Pakistan in one room, we may be speaking 7 different languages. We may be following 7 different religions, or we may be followers of Islam, but we may be following 30 or 70 different sects. So that's very important to have all these facts straight, because my talk will predominantly focus on the issue of nationalism. So over here we have, you may get confused whether I'm talking about the Pakistani nationalism or I'm talking about Baloch nationalism. But I mean, Pakistan came into being like 63 years back. So within Pakistan, we have all these ethnicities. Say the Sindhis, for example, they have had a history of several thousand years, and so do the Baloch and the Pashtuns. So within Pakistan, I will be focusing on the Baloch nationalist insurgency and about the violations of human rights. Here's the roadmap, how we will go about it. When I talk about the threats, I will focus on 3 dimensions of the threat, say political assassinations. But again, this will predominantly focus on the Baloch nationalist movement, and I will explain why am I focused on the Baloch nationalist movement rather than not talking about the killings of the Hazaras or the sectarian killings or the Taliban activities. Pakistan seems to have a lot of problems, but I have narrowed down my research on political assassinations in Balochistan. And then the issue of enforced disappearances. Probably nowhere in the entire South Asian region would we see such a huge practice of enforced disappearances carried out by the state as is seen in Balochistan during the conflict. And the third segment of my presentation will look into the issue of press freedom and attacks on journalists. As you know, Pakistan has remained the world's deadliest place for reporters for the last 2 years. And then lastly, I will have recommendations to the stakeholders. But here you see a map of Balochistan. It's almost half of Pakistan, shares borders with Afghanistan and Iran. And it's one of the places in Pakistan which was actually historically forcefully incorporated in Pakistan in 1948. So when Pakistan became independent in 1947, from 1947 till March 1948, Balochistan was not a part of Pakistan. It was incorporated into Pakistan. It serves as a supply route to the NATO forces stationed in Afghanistan. And it also is a place where the US government after 9/11 has been using air bases to carry on, carry strikes against the Taliban, and the air base was recently taken away. And the US government has been endeavoring to establish a consulate in Balochistan. The Pakistani authorities have not been willing to offer them space. The reason happens to be the dispute over the Quetta Shura of Mullah Omar, because the Americans and the Afghan authorities think that Taliban are being patronized by the Pakistani government to counter the Baloch nationalist movement. So if you like one day find out Mullah Omar in Quetta, don't get ever surprised the way Bin Laden was found somewhere in Abbottabad. Then this also is, I'm sorry. This is a place which will feature in the upcoming gas pipeline projects between Iran, Pakistan, and India. And the region has come under tremendous Chinese and Iranian influence in the recent times. And over the years, there has been talk about the Pakistani government's misuse of the weapons which were provided to the government to fight the Taliban against the Baloch nationalists. So I will talk more about it when I come to the recommendations that the US Leahy Amendment actually prohibits the government's, prevents the US government from funding units of the military which get involved in human rights abuses in different parts of the world. Balochistan is actually the land of superlatives. It's the richest in terms of natural gas, gold, and copper. For the last 50 years, it has accounted for Pakistan's highest number of requirements of gas. But it, at the same time, happens to be the poorest in terms of social indicators. The lowest literacy rate and health situations are extremely depressing in the province. And the Balochs complain of underrepresentation in the Pakistani military and foreign services. Based on these two things, one is the resource distribution, that the Balochs say that they don't benefit from their own natural resources, and their social indicators happen to be the most bleak in the country. So they have had fights with the federal government. They have had insurgencies in 1948 over the forceful incorporation. Then in 1973, 58, 62, 1973. But my research focuses on the ongoing insurgency and the longest, which started in 2004. There are a number of stakeholders in the whole conflict, and we have to understand who are the stakeholders, because Pakistan is a country where the military has taken over a number of times. So it's not as if that the Pakistani civilian government is the same as the Pakistani military. So the Pakistani military is there. Within the military, rogue elements such as the inter-services intelligence and the military intelligence, they are even not in the control of the military. So we have the secret services, we have the civilian government, we have the nationalist separatists, then we have like the death squads, which are anti-nationalist, and we have other defenders of democracy such as scholars and professors. Now, most of the people who have been killed in the ongoing conflict and attacks by the government predominantly include leaders who clearly advocate an independent Balochistan. Then there are the ones who had historically remained a part of the Pakistani political system, but they have undergone radicalization, and now they ask for, independence. But then there are the ones who are moderate nationalists. They have also been targeted allegedly by the secret services. And a lot of pro bono lawyers, as I talk about the disappearances, a lot of pro bono lawyers, university professors, human rights activists, and even the members of the missing persons have also been targeted by the government at a number of times when people do not give up their political activities. There was this example of a Baloch nationalist leader, Bramdag Bukti, whose sister and niece were attacked recently and killed. Over here, you see a vast range of political leaders who have been killed, including a former senator, heads of different political parties, as you see their designations. So the government or the military lumps everyone together in Balochistan, whether you are a former senator or you are, you ask for provincial autonomy within the Federation of Pakistan. People have been targeted, killed, but like these are a few most high-profile people. How did these killings begin? They were not spontaneous. Actually, they were very planned. Musharraf was very authoritarian, and he publicly threatened the Baloch that if you don't stop giving up your demands for autonomy, for independence, or for control on your rights, we will hit you in a way that you wouldn't know what hit you. And his warning immediately led to the most high-profile killing in Balochistan in 2006, when a former governor and the chief minister of the province, Akbar Bukti, was killed. He was actually the chief negotiator between the province and the center. And his killing led to a tremendous change in the entire Baloch nationalist movement, which what previously was a kind of a demand only for provincial autonomy transformed into a full-fledged demand for an independent Balochistan. And the genuine leaders of the province felt threatened that probably they would be the next targets, as some of them were targeted. So the top leadership of Balochistan fled the country and went out. And this gave rise to radical groups which used violence, and they still use violent means to achieve their objectives for an independent Baloch homeland. And negotiations after Bukti's killing also break down. So at this moment, we don't have talks between the federal government and the province on any of the issues. And many political parties, the Baloch moderate political parties, gave up their seats in the Pakistani parliament. Over here now you see a list of the best of the leaders among the nationalists, say a former chief minister, a former leader of the opposition, a former senator. These all leaders fear that they probably would be targeted. So all Baloch leaders are right now on exile. So if one proposes negotiations between the Baloch and the center, who are they going to negotiate? Because the leadership stays outside the country. The Pakistani military denies that anything is wrong in Balochistan or there is, or it's involved in any kind of killings. These political killings have not been investigated. That if the government is not involved, then who else is responsible for all these killings? So there is not a clear situation to find out who is responsible. Instead, the government is embarked, I mean the military, predominantly the secret services, have embarked upon a process of planting one leader against the other, so that as long as the general leadership stays outside the country, they have an opportunity to bring the other leaders and to give them a chance to rule. But this has not helped. The more they divide and rule in Balochistan, the more the situation worsens. The military does not cooperate with the provincial government, and there are insufficient confidence building measures so that we think like this conflict is going to an end. The state security forces have been a lot more politicized, and there is an increase like in their political roles now. The security forces, which are predominantly responsible to guard the borders with Afghanistan, they bribe political leaders, they plant political leaders, they disrupt political rallies. So all these things have caused a lot of problems in Balochistan at this time, because the civilian government has no say. The secret services dictate the political discourse in Balochistan. On the other hand, the nationalists have equally responded with violence, not the moderates, but the armed groups, by killing innocent non-Baloch and professionals. They've even gone to the extent of attacking fellow Baloch leaders who would like to live within the Federation of Pakistan, and there have been similar instances. But this situation gets worse, like when we have the rise of a middle class, which is extremely unwilling to reconcile with Pakistan. They're very, very radical. Now the second segment of the presentation looks into the issue of enforced disappearances. And most of the people who are disappeared, they are simply the ones against whom there are no charges. They don't know their whereabouts. They predominantly come from Baloch ethnic community. We have a lot of other ethnic communities in Pakistan or in Balochistan. But among the thousands of or hundreds of cases of disappeared, there are no other ethnic members of other ethnic groups who have been who have been whisked away. Now, these include like different people. Some of them are political activists, students, lawyers, and there are so many times when the security forces would come up in a convoy to pick up the political activists and take them away. And these are like, they predominantly come from middle class families, and once they disappear, their families actually lose their breadwinners. And what is their age bracket, how old they are, according to Human Rights Watch, they vary. Like the youngest man they documented was someone who was only 12 years old, and the oldest was like someone as old as 80 years of age. Now, when people disappear, some of them have been lucky enough to be released, but many of them say that they have been subjected to torture. They are kept in solitary confinement. They're extensively investigated. They're deprived of food, and they have no access to lawyers. They don't have access to their families. And also they're warned. Like if they are ever released, if they talk to the media, if they talk to anyone, they will either get killed or their family members would also be picked up. And there are also similar cases when people disappeared, they returned, but when they spoke to the media, they were whisked away again, and they never came back. Now, how many have disappeared in Balochistan is a disputed figure. The nationalists or the relatives of the missing persons blame the Pakistani military directly for all these disappearances. But the military says no one is disappeared. No one is like missing in Balochistan. It's just a political gimmick. The civilian government, however, has been a little more responsive. It says, yes, people have disappeared. We are trying to resolve the problem. We are trying to negotiate with the military. So the civilian government acknowledges that 110 people have disappeared. But during Musharraf's time, when the issue rose for the first time, the interior minister said in a public press conference, Aftab Ahmad Sherpao, that we have 4,000 people in our custody. We're investigating them and they would eventually be released. But after the change of the government, now the interior ministry in Pakistan disowns as a statement and they say they don't have 4,000 people there. However, more neutral organizations such as the Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch say there are hundreds have disappeared, but they also complain not having access to the province to properly document the cases of disappeared people. The civil society organizations in Balochistan, including the families of the missing persons, say that around 10 to 12,000 people have disappeared because they say that many times people are warned not to talk to the media, they don't register complaints, or many areas are inaccessible, they don't speak Urdu language. So because of all these problems, a lot of cases, they say, have not been documented yet. Now, most of the members of the missing persons have taken up the whole issue in Balochistan. The political parties have not responded. These are like the relatives of the missing persons who have formed their own civil society groups. They campaign peacefully and they apply different tactics to highlight the issue of the disappeared by, like, addressing a press conference or setting up a hunger strike camp or forming calendars or brochures on special occasions. But this is like one of the most important features, the last one, what you see, that the families of the disappeared people establish hunger strike camps. In front of the Supreme Court, in front of the local press club, in front of the governor's house, in front of the chief minister's house. So places where they think it's like very, very possible that they can get some attention. But it's not always, even a peaceful struggle or peaceful demand for one's family rights is not possible. The government also does not like it at times. Now, one example is of this gentleman who is speaking at the Karachi Press Club about his son who disappeared, that I will mention in the coming slide, that his son disappeared and he eventually got into one of these civil society organizations, the Voice for the Missing Baloch Persons. And he is the vice chairman of this organization. Now, then here you see the clip from the Express Tribune newspaper where he was threatened that in response to his press conference, his son was in their detention and they would eventually kill his son if he did not give up his struggle. He thought they were kidding, but they were not actually. Days after his conversation with the media, his son, Jalil Reki, who had disappeared in 2009, who was the information secretary of the Baloch Republican Party, was eventually killed and dumped. Now, Jalil Reki is not the only case. Around hundreds of these disappeared people have been killed and dumped, as the Amnesty International calls this practice. In the last 6 months, at least 400 of these disappeared people, some of them like disappeared a decade back, like 6 months back, their bodies are found dumped and trashed under a bridge or at isolated places. These bodies oftentimes show marks of torture. They are mutilated, and at times they are shot so many times or they're so badly mutilated that even family members don't recognize them. So the authorities even don't know, the family members don't know whether they should wait for their loved ones to return or what happened to them. Now, the fault lines over here are that the Pakistani government does not conduct an effective inquiry into the matter. If the government is not responsible, then who else is conducting all these killings? Who are picking up students from campuses? Someone has to be accountable for all these massive disappearances and killings. The judicial process is very slow. In 2007, when the Chief Justice took up the issue of the disappeared people, Pervez Musharraf sacked him. He was like, this is an issue of national security. You don't have to talk about it. Now the Chief Justice is trying to resolve the issue, but even the representatives of the secret services don't show up in the hearings. The members of the ISI or the military intelligence, they're like, we're not accountable in front of the Chief Justice. So local police does not cooperate with the families of the disappeared people because they don't register cases. If you go to the local police, they were like, well, if the Secret Service agents picked someone away, we can't register a case. So if you don't have a case registered in the first place, you can go to the High Court and you can't move forward. International human rights groups And the international media has no access to Balochistan. One of the American journalists, Carlota Gall, who worked for the New York Times, got into Quetta. She was beaten up and kicked out of the country. Then you had the example of Nicholas Schmeidel. A lot of American journalists who have tried to go to Balochistan have been kicked out of the country. I mean Pakistan. So the families of the disappeared people, as you saw in the hunger strike camps, many of the kids have abandoned their studies. They have to carry out all these protests. The government does not provide compensation to the families of the disappeared people. And the situation is further worsened by deliberately engulfing journalists. I mean, the government at times, or the nationalists for that matter too, are very, very intolerant toward a free press in Balochistan. And as you know, as I said earlier, that for the last 2 years, Pakistan has been the world's deadliest place for reporters. But within Pakistan, Balochistan accounts for the highest number of reporters who were killed in 2010 and 2011. But now everyone does not or is not as much a celebrity as Salim Shehzad or someone who works for a Western newspaper whose case gets documented. So many of these journalists' killings don't get investigated at all. And foreign journalists, as I said, have no access to Balochistan. And in Balochistan, according to the BBC, according to a recent report, Pakistan has blocked around 500 websites. Now, this is the highest number of internet censorship that takes place in Pakistan. And recently, they even went on to publicly announce, seek a tender from a company which could filter internet in Pakistan. So the worst type of internet censorship takes place in Balochistan. There have been attacks on newspapers, newspaper offices have been besieged, and editors have escaped assassination attempts as well. The national media in Pakistan does not cover Balochistan sufficiently for a number of reasons. None of the top Pakistani newspapers or television channels is headquartered in Balochistan. So we have had a remarkable media revolution in Pakistan. Say, like 45 new news channels have been launched, but not one of them is based in Balochistan or headquartered in Balochistan. They have a correspondent who works out of Quetta, which is the provincial capital, but rest of the whole Balochistan, where actual conflict exists, gets totally not reported in the Pakistani mainstream media. Over here you see a couple of journalists who have been killed predominantly by the government. One example is of this gentleman, Mohammad Khan Sasoli, who was a participant of my workshop, which was funded by NED. I was the master trainer at the workshop, and he was like also my stringer for 5 years when I was working for the Daily Times. During the workshop, he stood up and he said, guys, here's me. I'm receiving threats from the secret services. Can you guys help me out? I think they're going to kill me. What we did, we wrote letters to editors across Pakistan that this journalist and his friends are all under threat, and probably he will be killed. Nothing was done, and eventually he was killed. So everyone has got a story. All these slides have a lot of footnotes that I can share after the talk and in the coming days with you. So where do we go about it? I think like Balochistan has reached at a point where all the messengers, I mean journalists, are also being attacked. Human rights activists are being attacked. So the conflagration is expanding. How do we go about a solution? I have recommendations for the Pakistani government if they are willing to listen to the recommendations, but it's very important that at this point, what is the most urgent issue is the kill and dump policy has to stop. Not that I say people should disappear, people should be kept illegally, but at this time, every day on an average basis, 2 to 4 disappeared people are killed and dumped. These killings have to stop in the first place so that you detain them, you conduct an inquiry matter in the coming times. But those who are familiar with the history of Bangladesh, where Pakistani military formed anti-Bengali underground groups such as Al-Badr and Al-Shams, right now there are groups funded by the government to kill nationalists, and they're not apologetic about it. They make phone calls to the media and they claim responsibility. So these groups have to be dismantled by the Pakistani government. Such policies don't work. They did not work in the past. When Pakistan did this with Bangladesh, East Pakistan, it became a separate country. So they have to realize that these death squads will backfire for the state of Pakistan. And the role of the military intelligence agencies, the Pakistani secret services have to be brought under the control of the civilian government. If you have a civilian government, there is no role for the military whatsoever to play in the country's polity. And one of the other problems is the lack of representation in the security apparatus. The frontier corps does not include the local Baloch. The police comes from Punjab. So all in the military, in Pakistani military, they have a Baloch regiment which is headquartered outside Balochistan, coincidentally in Abbottabad. So it's all a problem. The representation of the local people have to be ensured in the security apparatus in Balochistan. And now that the conflict has expanded over a period of, say, 10 years, there has to be a Truth and Reconciliation Committee. Mistakes have been made, say, a committee headed by a former judge or representatives of the Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch, so that we find out what has been happening in Balochistan and who has been carrying out all these killings with absolute impunity so far. And the press freedom has to be ensured. I mean, I am personally a journalist. I'm in exile. My online newspaper is blocked in Pakistan. We continuously tell the government that we are the messengers. Don't kill the messengers. At least have some respect for the journalists, for human rights activists, so that the truth at least comes out. So press freedom has to be ensured not only in Balochistan, elsewhere in the country. This is a very, very important recommendation for the Pakistani government. They have to investigate the killings of all these Pakistani journalists who have been killed, particularly in Balochistan. The only killing that has been investigated in the last 10 years is that of Daniel Pearl of the Wall Street Journal. Otherwise, killings have not been investigated in Pakistan of reporters. International human rights groups have to be provided access. Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch or the Human Rights Commission of Pakistan should be allowed access to Balochistan to determine what actually is happening and who are the players behind all this. And families of the disappeared people have to be compensated if the government is not involved in all these killings. Now, the Baloch moderate nationalist parties also have a significant role to play. In 2008, they boycotted the electoral process because General Musharraf was there. Now, here's I talked about the policy of divide and rule. The more the nationalists, the moderate nationalists, boycott elections, it provides the secret services an opportunity to plant their own men in the government process, in the electoral process. So right now that we don't have the military directly involved in the government, I would encourage the political parties, such as the Balochistan National Party or the National Party and the Jamhuri Watan Party, to get back into the electoral process so that they communicate with the rest of the world through democratic means. And they have to condemn the killings of the innocent people, even if they are carried out by the Baloch armed groups. There have to be some rules of engagement, whether you seek separation, you seek the right to self-determination, but there is no justification for killing of the innocent civilians by the armed groups. So they have to be a lot more clear about it. They have to condemn all these killings of innocent civilians, and they have to disassociate themselves with all these forms of atrocities. The Baloch militants also have a lot of responsibility. Their all case has been remarkably undermined in the recent times by their attacks on innocent civilians from other ethnic communities. They have to understand that if they carry on these attacks on civilians, then they become equal oppressors. If you are already oppressed yourself, you have to understand what it means to be an oppressed member of the society. So they have to stop these killings. And similarly, they have been carrying out attacks on fellow Balochs who would like to become a part of the Pakistani parliamentary process. These killings should stop on their part. And there have been times when they have pressurized the international NGOs. They have to, like in 2009, one of the organizations kidnapped the Balochistan director of the UNHCR. And they were like, their only motive was to internationalize their cause, to raise awareness internationally about the Baloch plight. I think this is not the right way. You kidnap a foreign national so that the Western media provides you attention. Such tactics won't help the Baloch groups. And they have to, here is the point. I think I don't want to be very idealistic in terms of suggesting them to give up their arms, because throughout the entire conflict in 2009, these were the only people who announced a unilateral ceasefire to the Pakistani government. That, okay, we are not going to fire a bullet. Are you going to respond? So ideally, I mean, I would recommend them to carry out a peaceful democratic struggle. These are all the people who have historically been a part of the Pakistani parliamentary process. But until the Pakistani state stops military operation in Balochistan, these groups will continue their militaristic style of negotiation with the Pakistani government. The US government as the custodian of democracy across the world, has a huge responsibility in terms of seeing what Pakistan as an ally has been doing with its own citizens. Is this what your taxpayers' money is supposed to go for? You know, the US government remarkably trained the Frontier Corps, and you developed their capacity. You gave them more weapons, you gave them more training. The Frontier Corps has been involved in whisking away political activists. These are nationalist, secular political activists who have nothing to do with Taliban activities. So the American funding has testified by the Amnesty International in February this year in front of the US Congress that they had ample evidence that Pakistan was violating the Leahy Amendment and Pakistan was abusing American weapons which were supplied to fight the war on terror. And now, as I said before, that all the stakeholders are outside Balochistan. They can go back to Balochistan, as I showed you a slide, that a lot of them have been killed. So these nationalists can't go back until there is a guarantor, whether the US government guarantees that let's facilitate a conference, as somewhere in Dubai or somewhere in London, bring all these stakeholders on negotiation table. Otherwise, this is not going to be possible. If the US does not do it, European Union will have to do it. But right now, the Balochs don't trust the Pakistani military. They have a long history. There were the times when the Pakistani authorities, put their hands and offered a solemn pledge that if you give up your guns, we will forgive you. Hundreds of them were massacred. Such promises have never been fulfilled. So until there's an international conference which brings both sides on negotiation table, I think the problem can't be resolved. Similarly, the abusive use of the Frontier Corps has to be taken care of. The Frontier Corps, basically, as the name suggests, is supposed to guard the border with Afghanistan. But since it comes from FATA, from the Pashtun-speaking region, so they share the same language with Taliban. And there are so many instances when the Frontier Corps arrested the Taliban, but never ever told the media where they disappeared because they all spoke the same language, they share the same culture. So the local Baloch have to be recruited and provided space in the Frontier Corps and trained to take care of the border that is shared with Iran and Afghanistan. And Pakistan has to be urged on in terms of improving its human rights record. We know it's not that easy for the US government. It has its limits of influence. But as a country that is the largest recipient of American aid after Afghanistan, there's a need to press Pakistan to sign the Convention for Protection of All Persons from Enforced Disappearance. And similarly, a lot of American organizations have been encouraging free media in Pakistan. So Pakistani government has to be urged at this point to lift the ban on all these online news sources and websites and blogs, because throughout the world we see that online journalism provides some hope, whereas Balochistan is not benefiting from it. What can the international NGOs do to help the situation? The situation is murky. We don't know how clear the situation is in Balochistan because there are no detailed research studies on Balochistan. There are no conferences on Balochistan. There is no conversation on Balochistan. So the international human rights organizations have to encourage, say, in terms of building the capacity of the local journalists over there so that they write better, they convey the message better. And right now, as I said, there are the political activists who have disappeared, those who are in danger, those who have been killed. There's a need to protect them, to take them to safer places, to provide them more important counseling, those who are victims of torture. So in order to facilitate their cases of asylum, provide them better services. Otherwise, these are the remaining moderates and Democrats in Pakistan and eventually in Balochistan. Eventually, all of them would be eliminated one after the other. And I would also encourage the international organizations to have more involvement in terms of monitoring the human rights abuses by, say, having an online database. At this time, we don't even have a full-fledged professional database of the disappeared people. The Human Rights Commission of Pakistan does not take responsibility. The ministry in Pakistan does not take responsibility. So we have to document all these issues on a more scientific style. And let's see, I mean, hope is not a policy, but we hope this is like a wonderful place of amazing people. And finally, I think the stakeholders have to realize that violence is not a solution to the problem. Pakistan has tried it 4 times in Balochistan. People have been massively killed and disappeared. Journalists, activists, they don't find enough breathing space in Balochistan. So eventually they have to sit on the negotiation table to resolve their own problems. After all, I mean, they are Pakistan's own people if Pakistan takes responsibility. Otherwise, I mean, the United Nations does protect people's right to self-determination, and Pakistan is a staunch supporter of people's right to self-determination. It has always supported the people's right to self-determination in Kashmir, and probably if these excesses will continue, Balochistan also will, has people are asking for the right to self-determination, the conflict will get worse. I thank you all. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Malik, for that sobering but important account of the situation in Balochistan. Before we turn to Q&A, let me turn to our discussant, Brian Joseph, for his comments on Malik's presentation.
Thank you, Malik. It was a fascinating and very sobering account of what's happening in Balochistan. And I think, as you noted, particularly in your recommendations, it's a situation that's poorly understood. It's poorly understood in Washington. I actually think it's fairly poorly understood in Pakistan. But in many, many ways, it has similar characteristics to what we see in many countries in Asia, where you have minority provinces or religious communities or other communities contesting for power, and as you'd called it, national identity, sort of nationalism, which gets to this question in Pakistan of, when you're looking at it and you're talking about it, one of the things I was struck by is that you talk about a struggle. I think you mentioned 5 insurgencies over 60 years in Pakistan, which gets to a question of what's the underlying motivator or driver of the Baloch struggles over these years. Is it a failure to buy into the idea of Pakistan as a state? Is it a resource allocation question? Is it a question of language rights, the imposition of an Urdu national language? Is it an imposition of a religion? You mentioned that most Pakistanis are Muslims, but in a sense, is that the question that motivates the Baloch insurgency? Because the consistency of it, the long-term nature of it, has few parallels in Asia. The 2 that jump to my mind are the ones in Burma, which are clearly political in nature, and then the one in Sri Lanka, which recently came to a very brutal end, where it was driven in large part by language rights. So I think when we get into the Q&A, I'd be very interested in if you can sort of talk about what you think the fundamental motivators are. Even your recommendations were stopping the hostilities, sort of ending the violence, ending the disappearances, ending the dumping policies, all of the violence in this state, but not so much about what it is politically that gets at this. And the reason I ask that is that the 18th Amendment was recently passed in Pakistan, which in some ways would have been one of the primary solutions, at least in theory, to addressing provincial rights. A devolution of power to the states, an empowerment of the provinces, a recognition of the federal structure of the state. Yet that never factored into your discussion of how does that, as a political solution to this challenge in Balochistan, how is it addressed? The other question, which, as we discussed this, and I discussed it with my colleague Wilson, which is it strikes us for the National Endowment for Democracy where, you know, if you want to be sort of tongue-in-cheek about it, democracy solves all problems. Pakistan has gone back and forth over 60 years between military governments and democratic governments. And I'm not an expert on Balochistan, so when I was first heard Malik give a talk a while ago, I tried to line up periods of military government in Pakistan with periods of increased militancy in Balochistan, and I couldn't discern a pattern. So the question for you is, what is the relationship between democratic politics in Islamabad and either the, what would you call it, the fueling of the insurgency and militancy in Balochistan, or the inverse? Which governments have been most accommodating to the Baloch struggle? The other thing, and I think this is probably one of the more important ones and also more difficult ones to get at, which is you talked a lot about moderate Baloch nationalists, and you talked about Baloch separatists. And there's an implication there that those who don't take up arms are more moderate as compared to the sort of the more extreme ones who take up arms. But the question is, in my experience in other countries, including in Pakistan, is there's often a close relationship in these struggles between the political entities that don't take up arms and the militant groups which do take up arms. Not at all suggesting that one is, in a sense, a proxy for the other. But I just don't understand Balochistan well enough to make that distinction. But I would be curious when we're talking about this is, what is the relationship between the struggle for autonomy, independence, federalism, national identity, however you want to define it, between those who have taken up arms against the state and those the moderate Baloch nationalists who you are recommending, in a sense, take part in the state politics? And then just two last questions. One, or thoughts. Balochistan also has a reputation as being one of the most conservative states in Pakistan. Women's rights aren't protected. The local power structures, the Sardars, there's a culture and a culture, a society that is not particularly supportive of, at least many people would argue, to what we consider liberal values. Liberal human rights values, protection of minority rights, protection of women's rights, and empowerment of women, those types of issues. So I guess the question is, in your experience, is that not a fair characterization of the political structure and political society in Balochistan? And if it is there a sort of a parallel struggle that's really taking place in Balochistan between fighting for Baloch rights, between the Baloch and the national government, and between the struggle inside your own community to address these fundamental challenges? And let me just conclude. I wanted to save enough time for Q&A. I know this is a very important one, as you can see from my comments. It's mainly questions, because I think when we were talking about this and I was thinking about it, that you've raised so many fundamental questions about a province that's of extreme political significance. I want to go back, and you mentioned this briefly. You started off with the Osama bin Laden quip, which I think is actually appropriate. But this is the state, for those who don't know. It's a huge state that borders both Khyber Pakhtunkhwa and Iran. All of the transit routes to Afghanistan go through this province. It's the oil and gas. It's a significant province, not just for Pakistan, but globally. But at the same time, your sort of recommendations to the United States were, as you sort of said, to insert itself in the politics of Balochistan, in a sense to insert itself to internationalize the Baloch struggle in a similar way that the Pakistanis want the international community to internationalize the Kashmir issue. But it strikes me as it's more, if you look at it from the Indian point of view, the Pakistani government response would probably be very similar to the New Delhi response to Kashmir, which is, this is a domestic issue, this is an internal issue. You don't want to internationalize the internal struggle of Pakistan. Kashmir is an international struggle from the Pakistani point of view. So I'm just curious, you brought up that comparison. Is it really beneficial to the Baloch and to the recognition of Baloch rights to bring in the United States in a manner of internationalizing and therefore exacerbating potentially some of these underlying tensions? And the other thing I think is very interesting here is, and you mentioned it, is the dislocation of Baloch political leadership. You mentioned the disappearances. That statistic is just fascinating. Anywhere from 0 by the government to 4,000 by the Interior Ministry to tens of thousands of people disappeared by the local actors. But in that mix, what it's resulted in is the dislocation of all moderate leadership, moderate journalists, moderate political leadership, and by extension, the empowerment of militant groups and extremist groups. So from a policy point of view, how do you get the Pakistani state to move away from a policy which, at least on the surface, seems to be dislocating moderate voices, and if not encouraging extremist voices, certainly having that be one of the direct effects of not having moderate voices? And I just want to end on one quick quote actually from a blog that you wrote about why you left Pakistan. I'm trying to get this year, in 2011, Malik wrote a blog post for the Committee to Protect Journalists called Why I Fled Pakistan. And he talks about, in a sense, of all of the threat that he's been under over the years as a journalist in Balochistan. And if you read his writings, a very, I must say, balanced, thoughtful, very factual journalist, but someone who still was the target of all sorts of violence and attacks on both his professional life, but also his personal life, that led you to leave Pakistan. In a sense, one of those in the state who was committed to addressing issues and not shying away from them, not pretending they weren't there, but also addressing them within the context of a democratic state. And you wrote, sorry, too many pieces of paper here. Here we go. While I know the life of the asylum seeker is often marked with extraordinary hardships, the demise of one's professional career and complete disconnection with family and friends, I believe no story is worth dying for. So you, in a sense, left the country because of the threats and the pressure you were facing. But then you went back and you started a paper to look at this question, recognizing that that's not a solution to the Baloch problem. For you, it was an essential piece of it because your life was at risk. But what can be done to encourage, support people like yourself, sort of the courageous people on the front lines of this struggle, to have a voice and an ability to work in Balochistan so that it isn't left with a situation of no moderate voices willing to stand up to take those risks? And again, I just think it's really, this is the first time I know of a Baloch, somebody from Balochistan itself, a Baloch in Washington talking about this issue. And I just commend you for your work. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian. You've touched on a very relevant point because, in fact, one of the key questions that Malik is grappling with is how to continue advocating for his cause while in exile, having received political asylum in the United States. And I know that's an important question that you are considering as you look towards your next steps and your future in this country. So Brian has laid out a number of questions. I don't know if you want to address some of them or whether you want to turn to Q&A. Do you want to address some of his?
We'll mix them.
Okay.
Yeah.
I know that Asya Riyaz is one of our former fellows, and we're happy to see you, Asya. So I know you have to leave early, so go ahead with your first question.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'm Asya Riyaz. I represent PILDAT. It's a Pakistani organization. Malik Sabaz, I'd like to address you. I think that your recommendations are what made me a little more optimistic. I do not share most of your analysis. And I think that what I don't share is when you say that Pakistani media, mainstream media, is not covering Balochistan well enough. I think that to be fair to whatever is going on in Balochistan and to be fair to the people of Pakistan, I think that you'll find that there are not many takers for what's going on, supposedly what the security agencies are doing. In fact, Bangladesh, the secession of East Pakistan, has left such a huge mark on the psyche of Pakistan that every talk show, every newspaper, every media comment, every citizen, every conversation says, let us not have Balochistan go the Bangladesh way. I think it's an important thing that you must, I think, acknowledge. It's fair to acknowledge that. I think another thing that is fair to acknowledge is, although you mentioned towards the end that those who have taken up arms against the state should stop civilian killings, I think in your presentation you should also acknowledge when you complain about the lack of sort of a set number or sort of the disagreement on the number of forced appearances, the forced killings, I think you must also acknowledge the number of settlers who've been killed in Balochistan. I think you must acknowledge the two sides of the scenario in Balochistan. I think we in Pakistan are trying to do that. I think Brian raised that, and I also have a lot of sort of problem with internationalizing, asking US, asking any other country of the world to come in And I'm not a representative of Pakistani government, I'm just a citizen. I think this is something that needs to be resolved within Pakistan. I think you very rightly pointed out this is something that needs to be resolved within the democratic institutions of Pakistan. You know, we were just talking, when I came in, I talked to, Brian, and I was talking to Wilson, what important steps have been taken under this government, 18th Constitutional Amendment, the sort of rights that have been given, not just to Balochistan, but to all provinces. You know, and you've been in Pakistan long enough to know how important a demand this was for all provinces, less so for Punjab, more so for smaller provinces. Those demands have been answered. The issues of resources, no, the issue, I see that you're making a face. The issue is implementation.
One of them was a disappeared people's case. Could you name a single disappeared person who ever recovered? See all those.
No, I think you've also just mentioned those who have been. I think what to me I would have liked to see.
I mean, let's have a very.
I would have liked to see that you mentioned the steps that the Supreme Court of Pakistan is taking. I would have liked to see that you would mention Chief Justice's remarks when he questioned and criticized, secret sort of intelligence agencies of Pakistan and said, you're arsonist, you've set Balochistan on fire. I think you should acknowledge whatever is going on in Pakistan, and I think you should try and present sort of a more balanced picture. I think it's very important that you point to the fact that when Balochistan National, and I think that's the only major political party, the others are groups, if Balochistan National Party Mingle Group decides to join the next election, I think we have on our hands a viable solution to this issue. I think when political parties have a seat at the table, we will have a sort of, we will move towards solution.
Thank you, Asia. Do you want to respond to that, Malik?
Oh, I think there were a lot more observations rather than comments. I just don't want to get into a conversation or in just response to the argument. But you see, the coverage on Balochistan increased in the Pakistani media after the congressional hearing. When you have a congressional hearing, like all the Pakistani media outlets covered Balochistan. Now I tell you what, the problem in Balochistan exists in Suwi, in Dera Bukti, in Gawadar, in Khuzdar. Can you name a single Pakistani channel which has a bureau office anywhere in Balochistan? Quetta is actually not the center of the problem in Balochistan. What I'm saying is the coverage of all these issues, say the gas pipelines, for instance, the presence of the Baloch in the infrastructure. So there are 30 districts in Balochistan. Every news story that we read, I mean, let's go for a content analysis of Express Tribune, Dawn, the Daily Times for which I worked. I was one correspondent responsible for 30 districts. So every deadline is Quetta. How would you, like hundreds and thousands of people have been displaced in Balochistan. So the media...
It's a commercial entity, it's not going to be opening...
Well, that's what I'm saying. That's why I'm saying.
Wait. Let him respond.
That's the best thing. Dawn or any media outlet has to clearly say, yes, we are a private enterprise. We have to make money. We don't stand for a mission. Then you have to take responsibility for that. As far as the settlers issue is concerned, yes, I talked about it that the nationalists have been attacking the settlers. But the way the state media has picked up that issue to divert attention from the actual issue of like hundreds and thousands of people who have been displaced, simply again shows the biases of the national media. This again further annoys the people in Balochistan. See, this phenomenon like of target killing of settlers never ever took place in the past. In 1948, there were insurgencies. In 73, these Baloch political parties have given tickets to Punjabi senators. A lot of these Punjabis and even some Pashtuns are a part of the BNP. So these, they've been accommodating. Rather than, getting into a tit-for-tat kind of a situation, it serves nobody's interest that, okay, our people are getting killed, so you are the culprit and the others are not. This doesn't serve the interest. And as far as solving the problem within the Federation of Pakistan is concerned, let's be very clear about it. Torture is not a country's domestic issue. This is what I quote Ali Dayan Hassan of Human Rights Watch, who is the country director. I interviewed him for Dawn. I love that quote. Torture is not a country's internal issue. Disappearances are not an internal issue. We have to speak up because we are all we call ourselves as champions of democracy. Someone has to intervene to stop all these issues. If the US does not do it, I think the UN has to do it, Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, CPJ, they all have to do it, and they have to do it for everyone. We don't have to shy away from all these problems. This is an internal issue. Let's not talk about it. This doesn't help.
We have a number of hands up, so let me turn to the gentleman in the back near the column, and then the other gentleman next to him.
Hi, Stanley Kober. The history of South Asia for the last few decades has been the history of disintegration. The partition that resulted with the independence from the British Empire. Then the second partition when Bangladesh became independent. And there have been failed partitions. Sri Lanka was mentioned. All of these have been extremely bloody. Is that where we're headed, or another bloody partition?
It's indeed very bloody, yeah, no question about it. But every time I talk about a situation like Balochistan, the problem with the Pakistani state is it does not recognize diversity. The way the Indians, for instance, incorporated the Tamils or the others, like India has 24 official languages. If we had recognized the Bengali language in Pakistan, probably there wouldn't be a separatist movement by the Bengalis. So right now, yes, I mean, I am not a pessimist personally, but the situation in Balochistan has reached at a point of no return. Moderate voices like myself are very, very hard to exist in Balochistan. We can't reconcile or convince the younger generation. If the government of Pakistan does not realize that this problem has to be resolved internally, then obviously the way forward is, the Balochs oftentimes say they have got gas, gold, copper, a 750 long kilometer coast. They think, I don't know if they're right, but they think they can exist without Pakistan. And they have an argument, and they're like, Pakistan is landlocked, they argue, except for Karachi, where the Sindhis are also trying to become an independent country.
The gentleman in the black tie.
Your speech is very timely. Tomorrow is World Press Freedom Day, so thank you.
And if you could identify yourself, please.
I'm Tom Risen. I'm a researcher with Simon & Schuster. You mentioned the Leahy amendments to keep arms out of sanctioned zones to crush dissidents. Could you tell us a bit about the background of that in Pakistan, along with sanctions, possibility of sanctions to restrict the sale of censorship equipment to the Pakistani government that could be used to crush information dissidents, not just weapons, information weapons?
Yeah, thank you. I think I've been very respectful of the civilian government in Pakistan. So yes, there is a problem in terms of the internet censorship that takes place. The US government in the aftermath of 9/11 has been almost entirely engaged with the Pakistani military. It has been military to military contacts, and you have almost given them a blank check. In the last 10 years, Pakistan received 20 billion American dollars. And there was no enough accountability. So if that funding is unplugged, ideally, if that funding is unplugged, the military will not have the money to undertake all these picnics, say in Balochistan, say elsewhere. Now, when I talk of the internet censorship or the attacks on journalists, they are not sanctioned by the Pakistan People's Party government. Like when my newspaper was blocked by the Pakistan Telecommunication Authority, I had to wait until Freedom House issued its report quoting the military authorities, that the military authorities had recommended to the Pakistan Telecommunication Authority to shut down the online newspaper. Similarly, one of the journalists who was killed, and he was also the coordinator of the Human Rights Commission of Pakistan. When he disappeared, the HRCP, the Human Rights Commission of Pakistan, did not blame the civilian government. It said, our man is in the ISI custody and the Pakistani military has to provide an accountability. It did not. The gentleman was eventually killed. Salim Shehzad, the journalist who was killed last year, was also reported by Human Rights Watch that we fear the guy will be killed. Within a few hours or days, he was killed. So yes, the military has been receiving a lot of funding from the US government, and the US government has to ask for explanation where the money is going. Is this the way forward to kill all Pakistani journalists, liberals, human rights activists? Then who are you going to engage after 2014?
We have two questions, one the blue shirt in front and then the woman behind him.
Thank you. My name is Singet Sereng. I come from a region in Pakistani control called Gilgit-Baltistan. Thank you, Malik, for your presentation, and Brian, for your comments. I have two observations. First is about the settlers in Balochistan. Based on my conversations with a lot of political activists and members of BNM and BRP, what I've realized is that these settlers are just not settlers living in Balochistan to earn living. Many of them who have been killed have very close association with ISI. These cobblers and these barbers who have been implanted in Balochistan, they are long arm of the state. So I think before we just use the word settler, we really need to segregate these people based on their intentions and why the Baluchis are attacking certain people who come from Punjab area. It's the same case in Gilgit-Baltistan. It's about 700 kilometers away from Islamabad, and we have all the cobblers and all these barbers coming from Punjab and working there, even though it's really hard to make a living. So definitely they have some economic incentive to be there. My second observation is about Pakistan and democracy. I believe that Pakistan was created on a certain ideology, which provides sort of superiority for a certain race and religion. So it's very difficult to promote democracy, a viable democracy in Pakistan based on the ideology that it was formed. I mean, it will be a ad hoc democracy that we see, military, civilian combination of democracy, but I don't think Pakistan can be a country where every human can have equal rights, irrespective of their religion or race. Thank you.
Malik.
Do you want me to comment? Yeah, I mean, again, I won't be judgmental about all this. As I've recommended, even the nationalists, if the government thinks like they are involved into anti-state activities, the best way is to bring them to justice in Pakistani courts. So yes, that's another problem. The settlers issue is people come from other provinces. They are a lot better educated than the Baloch. The first university, like the Punjab University, was established in 1885. Balochistan had the first university in 1971. So the people over there are not compatible. The settlers come and grab all the jobs. They are in the civilian administration and the military, and they grab all the top jobs. Then it's like very easy for them, say, to forge documents to create demographic imbalance in Balochistan. The people from other provinces come to Balochistan, they compete in the civilian services in the PCS and CSS. They become the master of the province. So the Baloch have had all these grievances as well. What was the second point about? Religion. I mean, see, one of the Baloch the history of Balochistan is very similar to Kashmir, where the Maharaja acceded with India, but the people did not vote. Similarly, the Khan of Kalat was forced to accede with Pakistan, but the Baloch parliament had a wonderful session where both the houses actually rejected. But I love the quote, which came from one of the nationalist leaders, Gozbaksh Bizanjo, who is considered as the father of modern Baloch nationalism. He said, if the mere fact that we are Muslims requires us to join Pakistan, then why shouldn't we join Iran and Afghanistan, pre-existing Islamic states? So in Baloch society, religion, people are like Sunni Muslims, but Islam does not determine people's way of life. The Balochiyat, the code of conduct, already exists. So over there, like ethnicity, the Baloch identity is a lot more superior. The Baloch tribal chief would determine rather than the local mullah. So yes, the imposition of the Islamic identity has not worked in Balochistan. The imposition of Urdu has not worked there. And now they're like trying to radicalize the society by promoting Taliban. Yesterday there was this bombing in Quetta, which killed 5 people. The TTP claimed responsibility for the Pakistani Taliban. Just 3 days back, an activist of the ICRC was kidnapped and killed in Quetta, again by the Taliban in Balochistan. So this is, if the state thinks Islam is an antidote to the nationalist movement, I think they're mistaken, and it just leads to more problems.
Question over here.
My name is Christina Lamb. I'm from the Sunday Times of London. Thank you, Malik, for that. I thought it was fascinating, and I think it's terribly sad that people like you and so many Pakistani journalists are being forced to leave the country because of the situation. I had a small taste of what you're up against in end of 2001 when ISI broke my hotel room door at 2 in the morning and arrested me and held me for 2 days in Quetta. So I know it's very, very real. I just wondered, you mentioned briefly about the reports of Mullah Omar being in Quetta. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about the Taliban and how this links with all of this. I mean, is part of this that ISI don't want people to know what's going on in Balochistan from that point of view, or what is their link?
That's a fantastic question. I wish I did. I knew where Mullah Omar is, but I'm a lot more certain where Mullah Omar is than knowing where bin Laden was. To be very honest about it, it's like the US, as I talked about the consulate issue. The US has got an embassy in Islamabad, a consulate in Karachi, one in Lahore, one in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa and Peshawar. Why is Balochistan an exception? What do Pakistanis have to hide about Balochistan that they're not willing to allow the Americans be there? We have told the Pakistani government and authorities to be very transparent about it. Kandahar is 120 kilometers away from Quetta. So the people who are responsible to guard the border are Pashtuns. Not that I don't want to single out an ethnic group, but they speak the same language as the Taliban do. So the Quetta Shura has been based there for a long time. Why? It should not surprise you. Because when Karzai was not the president, where else was he? He was hiding in Quetta. He was not hiding, but he was living in Quetta. So this is historically word that the Afghan leaders, when they're in opposition, they stay in Quetta. Right now that Mullah Omar is in opposition, he's staying somewhere in Quetta. Now the Quetta Shura is their cabinet, which actually makes decisions. When you talk of, say, taking action against the Haqqani network, the Haqqani network actually seeks its institutional and inspirational religious and organizational inspirations from the Quetta Shura, which is totally untouched. Now, another important element is this government in Balochistan. The coalition government comprises of the Jamiat Ulama Islam. Jamiat Ulama Islam provides manpower to the Taliban activists through their madrasas, which are spread all across Balochistan. Now, these all people hold senior ministries. Mullah Wase is the senior minister in Balochistan government who marched against the attack on Afghanistan. Now, there was a time when the US government wanted to expand the drone strikes from Waziristan to Balochistan. The first ones to move forward or move a resolution on the Balochistan Assembly were the JUI guys. So in the past, Taliban were a militaristic force. Right now, they also have a political face. So when you read the newspaper, you're like, oh, the Balochistan Assembly condemns drone strikes or like opposed. So they use it as a tool to blackmail, the government. Lastly, as I talked about all these Baloch insurgencies for the last 6 years, 6 times, not a single time did the Baloch ever carry out a suicide bombing. All suicide bombings that take place in Quetta are carried out by Taliban. They are a Taliban-specific modus operandi carried out in Balochistan. So there's a lot of evidence, but the Pakistani government does not want to take action against the Taliban because they look at them as a good tool to counter India once, they don't want India to have an influence in the future dispensation and post-2014 world in Afghanistan.
Do we have any other questions in the audience? Yes, the gentleman in the front.
I'm from Lithuanian heritage. I'm Andrew Iva. I've been following the Baloch cause lately. Former Afghan activist back in the 80s. There was talk of a bloody partition earlier in the audience. There were some unbloody partitions. Lithuania's separation from the Soviet Union was unbloody. The Slovenian separation from Serbia was relatively unbloody, 100 total casualties both sides. The key to those was the existence of a strong Serb or Russian element, pro-democratic, that cooperated tactically and strategically with the independence forces in Slovenia and Lithuania. Is there such potential in the Punjabi culture of Pakistan for such a democratic force to cooperate with the strategically and tactically with Baloch aspirations for self-determination?
Well,
and could you specifically describe what you know about that possibility?
The only instance that we have is from the insurgency of the 70s when some rich kids from the elite families, they joined the movement. They are known as the London group, including these celebrities like Ahmad Rashid and Najam Sethi. So the liberal forces in Punjab, they're not political entities, but like people who do care for Pakistan, those who believe in multiculturalism, who do believe in in other people's rights. Yes, people have stood up for Baloch rights, but again, they're not political forces at the moment, because the tragedy is that every political party in Pakistan, unfortunately, had its birth from dictatorship, like Nawaz Sharif, who was the chief minister of General Ziaul, and Zulfikar Ali Bhutto, who remained a lot more political and moderate. Bhutto was the foreign minister of Dictator Ayub Khan. So indigenous, actual democratic parties have never emerged out of Pakistan. But there is a great realization within the leftist activists, civil society activists in Punjab, say someone like Asad Rahman, whose father was the Chief Justice of Pakistan. They keep writing regularly in the media, and they say, like, if the Baloch want the right to self-determination, go ahead, we back you. Because now the Punjabi intellectuals have nothing to defend the government policies. And at times, like, they feel embarrassed the way the military is carrying out these operations. Now, I think the only time Punjab stood up against the military was, not the military, but against Musharraf, was the judicial movement, for instance. The Chief Justice was inducted on the judicial movement when the Chief Justice was sacked. Yeah. So Nawaz Sharif's political party waged a long march, saying that this enough is enough. The men in khaki can't like take the whole country hostage. As the role of the military increases in the country's politics, there is a realization in Punjab that like it's too much, especially like among the civil society activists as well. But I don't see it on the part of the political parties. One of the things I really wanted to be asked, and nobody ever asked me, but it's the phenomenon of Imran Khan, the rise of new political parties. The way, the military encourages the formation of political parties and individuals. This is a lot more tragic. That Imran Khan is like he has no internal agenda. The only agenda is he's anti-America. You can be the most popular leader anywhere in the Islamic world, not only in Pakistan. You can become the prime minister, say, in Afghanistan if you are anti-America. But that's not a policy. You have to have local political parties which stand for people's rights. So even if we see the future political parties, say the Pakistan Tehreek-e-Insaf, the Muslim League, the People's Party, they don't have any kind of support. Not only like the right to self-determination is a very distant desire, but of human rights issues. They don't say there have been long marches. Every Friday, the Jamaat Islami carries out a long march in support of the Palestinians, in support of the Kashmiris, in support of the Syrians. But they don't do it for their own Baloch people. Imran Khan takes out a long march every week against, the drone strikes, against America, against the cartoons published in Denmark. So these political parties have not owned their own people. There is not a sense of ownership among the Baloch.
Malik, I want to get to some of Brian's questions, and they touch upon the points you were just making. For instance, Brian mentioned, is there a correlation between the democratic governments in Islamabad and the situation in Balochistan, or you don't really see any correlation between the nature of the government in Islamabad and the crisis as it unfolds in Balochistan? Also, Brian's other question about the relationship between the moderate Baloch leaders and the ones who are heading some of these political parties that you mentioned and the armed separatists, what sort of relationship do they have?
Well, you see, even democracy was restored in Pakistan right now with the help of a deal between Benazir Bhutto and Musharraf. So the civilian governments oftentimes come in Pakistan with a deal with the military that they don't want to disturb the military, they don't want to, cross certain red lines. So yes, throughout the history, there has not been a change of policy in Balochistan, whether the civilians ruled or the dictators ruled. Like the deadliest insurgency was in 1973, which was carried out by a civilian government of Zulfikar Ali Bhutto. But here is there are 2 points. Every time the civilians are in power, the military tries to embarrass them. Now, when hundreds of people disappeared during Musharraf's time, not a single of the disappeared was killed and dumped. All the killing and dumping policy began in April 2009 during People's Party government. So then when the People's Party government is over, they're like, these guys were responsible. Now, when the electoral chief minister, the elected chief minister, I remember he had an interview in the Herald magazine in July 2010. He's like, if I were powerful, I would kick the military and the frontier corps out of Balochistan. It was the cover story of Herald magazine, July 2010. He has no powers. President Zardari, like, he can't do much. So they are like, well, what else? Do you want to stand power, or do you want to touch all these issues? So even in the 70s, it was the same thing. But I don't blame the civilian governments, because the civilians don't carry out the operation. It's the military that carries out the operation. Secondly, yes, I don't like, I'm not very, like, I don't blame the political parties as well. Like, there have been examples when political parties in Pakistan come into power, they become a lot more authoritarian. They become less democratic when they are in power. Say, like the People's Party. People's Party has had authoritarian tendencies. The Nawaz League, like in 1997, Nawaz Sharif passed an amendment. He wanted to become the next Amir al-Mominin in Pakistan, which was called the Sharia bill. So these problems do exist, but the problem is because the political parties don't evolve in Pakistan. They get birth out of dictatorship. And I don't know if that answers your question, that part of it, but because in Balochistan, the military calls the shots. The Inspector General of the Frontier Corps is a lot more powerful than the governor and the chief minister. He issues statements on foreign affairs. He says India is involved into this. Afghanistan is involved into it. I'm like, you have around 200 plus major generals in the Pakistan military. And one major general controls the country's largest province, which is 8 times larger than Switzerland. And the chief minister is totally powerless. The corps commander makes decisions. He is an officer who has to ideally remain under the interior ministry or the defense ministry, but that does not happen. So the civilians can't do much about it. As far as the moderates and the hardliners are concerned, well, I mean, most of the people turn out hardliners when they are not given enough breathing space in Pakistan. Like in 1973, when the first Baloch government was dismissed, the Balochs and the Pashtuns, they were on one platform in Pakistan called NEP, National Awami Party. They sat in the same lockup and they said, well, we will break Pakistan, we will make a Pashtunistan and we will make a Balochistan. Eventually, the Pakistani state co-opted or integrated, that would be the better word, the Pashtuns in Pakistan. They were given more representation in the military and foreign services. And today, after the Punjabis, the Pashtuns are the greatest stakeholders. They no longer talk about breaking Pakistan. Whereas the same thing has not happened with the Baloch. The state has not integrated them, has not provided them opportunities. So this is similar to the way the military tries to embarrass the civilian government. The hardliners would try to embarrass the moderates. Like Bukti, he was the first leader from Balochistan who voted for Pakistan. He was their defense minister in 1950s. He was a former governor. He was a chief minister. He also voted for the government, actually. His party, the Jamhuri Watan Party, voted for the government, which had a pro-Musharraf chief minister. Now, when he was killed, the hardliners were like, where do you go from here? If you're so loyal to the Federation, and if they kill someone like you, where would we stand? So this gives more currency to the demands or to the stand of the hardliners, that someone like Bukti, someone like the guy on my slide, Habib Jaleb, he was a former senator of Pakistani Senate. Members of the parliament, they were Pakistan's people. They were not, those who were like running some armed groups or those who were running some peaceful organizations. Now, over here, the problem is there has been the rise for new political parties, which don't want to get into the Pakistani politics, and it has become difficult for those who contested elections in 1998. Now they can't contest elections because Pakistani politics is unpopular, and so many pro-Pakistan Baloch nationalists have been killed, and they're like, the youngsters don't trust them anymore.
Do we have any other questions from the audience?
We had no question from this side.
Yes. Right here.
My name is Cammy Bhatt. I'm from the Pakistani Spectator. And my question is that do you think that Balochistan would be happier under the influence of India if it gets separated from Pakistan? And my second question is, because of persecution in Balochistan, do you think it's justifiable for Baloch to apply for political asylum in this country? Thanks.
Can we say that one again?
Say that again.
Yeah.
Could you clarify your
question?
second question?
First one or second one?
Second.
Second one. That was
because of the persecution in Balochistan, Pakistani Balochi should get political asylum in this country, in these states?
You use the word prosecution. That means I am justified to get asylum.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. So
Right? Prosecution leads to asylum, right?
So justifiable. Okay. Thanks.
Yeah. The first question is, I'll be very candid. I don't know what future holds, but I hope they won't live in such miserable circumstances if they become independent. At this time, the British never subjected so many people to disappearance. Hundreds of people have disappeared in Balochistan. The British never did it. People were not killed and dumped. Now, because again, I have to take you back a little to the history. I know we don't have much time. Balochistan was the Kalat state. It was just like Nepal. When they became, when the partition took place, they were never ruled from Delhi by the British. They were ruled from London. They had their first confederacy in 1666. They were asked, do you want to live with Pakistan or with India, or you want to remain absolutely independent? They remained independent from August 1947 till 1948, March. They remained independent. Pakistan invaded their land but said, we promise that you will be granted maximum internal autonomy, and the federal government will only deal with currency. No, rather defense and communication. You will have your own currency. These are the people who had their own land, their own homeland, and you capture their land. Then in 1955, what happened? The Baloch province was further incorporated into the one unit to counter the Bengalis. They still did not say much. They contested elections in 1971. The only province where the local people had a government, like in Punjab and Sindh, the Pakistan People's Party had a government. The Baloch were extremely delighted that their people voted. They had their chief minister, a Baloch chief minister, a Baloch governor. The government was dismissed again. So there have been so many betrayals, and people are like, it's not for me. I'm a journalist. I am not mandated to say someone should ask for the right to self-determination. It's for their nationalist leaders to decide whether or not they can live happily. But the thing is, the way Pakistan was created on the name of Islam, let me be very honest. Pakistan does not treat all Muslims equally. All Muslims, the Shias in Pakistan are not treated equally. The Ahmadis are not treated equally. They were declared as non-Muslims. The Deobandis and the Brehlevis. So when we say that Pakistan is an Islamic country for the Muslims, I'm skeptical of the idea. Pakistan does not treat all the Muslims equally.
I'm afraid we've run out of time, so we have to conclude our conversation here, but it's clearly a conversation that will continue. I want to commend you, Malik, for your courage, and I know that we look forward to supporting you in various ways. Thank you all for coming. Thank you, Brian.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Munawar. Thanks.
Yes, Munawar. Good to see you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Brian.
Yeah. You have a better